My Brother Sam is Dead, Chapter 4. I was so excited I could hardly stand it. I felt all sparkly inside, sort of scared and happy both at the same time. When lunchtime came, I could hardly force myself to eat, although of course I did, so nobody would suspect anything. Being so excited worried me. A couple times I almost blurted something out. You know how it is when you get really interested in something, you forget what you're doing, or even where you are. Well, I was thinking so hard about going up to Tom Warup's and finally seeing Sam after all this time that I kept forgetting it was a secret. Once I started to say aloud, I wonder if Sam really shot anybody. And another time I began to say, maybe I ought to bring him something to eat. Both times I caught myself in time. The big question was to find an excuse to get away. On a school day, it would have been different. I would have just told the teacher I had to go home and help at the tavern and gone up to Warup's. But I didn't want to wait until Monday. Probably Sam would be gone by then anyway. After lunch, Father sent me out to the woodlot with the axe. Although it had warmed up some, the day was cloudy and the thin layer of snow was still on the ground. From the woodlot, the whole country looked white, as if it had been painted to match the church and the houses around it. I began cutting wood, wondering if I dared to sneak up to Warup's. I decided not to. After a while, Father would notice that there weren't any chopping sounds and come up to see what I was doing. I needed another excuse, and as I chopped, I tried to think of one. I was thinking like that when I first heard the horses. I straightened up, letting the axe dangle from my hand, and listened. There were a lot of them coming up the Fairfield Road from the south, and they were coming pretty fast. I stared down the road toward the bend. They would have passed right by me. At first, all I could hear was the heavy drum roll sound of hooves. Then I began to hear voices of men shouting and the jingling of harnesses. Then suddenly they came pouring around the bend of the road into sight. It was a party of maybe 20 people, and even at a distance, I could see that some of them had on blue uniforms, which meant that they were Continentals, the rebel troops. I stood back among the trees and watched them come galloping by. It was a pretty unusual thing to see a party of horsemen in Reading. They came on, and then they were swirling by, an officer wearing a sword in the lead, followed by the ordinary soldiers. Most of them had brown besses like ours slung over their backs. I guess they were mostly from the Fairfield train band. The horsemen pounded on, turning the snow on the road into mud. I kept down in the shadow of the trees, but they didn't pay any attention to me anyway. In a moment they had swept past. I darted through the trees to the road and looked after them. They pulled up at the tavern. The officer and 3 of the horsemen dismounted, and then the rest galloped off. I was scared, but I was curious. I figured the officer had gone into the tavern to drink a mug of beer. I hadn't really seen many true soldiers, and I wondered what they were like. I wasn't sure if it was safe, though. What would they do if they knew that Father was against the war? Still, I didn't want to be left out of the excitement, so I cut back through the woodlot and across the snowy fields so I could come up to the house from behind. I figured I would sneak in the kitchen door and listen to what was going on first. I was still carrying the axe. It was dangerous to run with an axe because you might fall and cut yourself, but it made me feel safer to hold it in my hand. I went on running through the light snow, and then I came up behind the barn and eased myself around it into the barnyard. I could hear the horses stamping and jingling their harnesses in front of the tavern. Somebody began to shout. The shouting was coming from inside the tavern. I darted across the barnyard and slipped into the kitchen. The door of the tap room was mostly closed, but there was a crack where it was hinged onto the wall. The shouting went on. I tiptoed to the door and put my eye to the crack. Mother was standing up against the fireplace wall. There was a man in front of her, holding a rifle sideways to keep her from getting away. 2 other soldiers had hold of Father from the back, twisting his arms behind him so he couldn't move. The officer in charge in front of him with a sword. We know you have a weapon, Meeker. Where is it?" he shouted. He jabbed the sword forward, as if he were going to stick it into Father, and at the same time, the men holding Father gave him a jerk. I began to shake and shiver, and I thought I would run someplace to get help, But then I realized there wasn't any help. Probably the Patriots were trying to get the guns away from all the Tories. I don't have it anymore, Father shouted. My loyal son Samuel stole it to go play soldier boy. The officer laughed. Come now, I'm not going to believe that story. You're all Tories here. We want your gun. He jabbed the sword again at Father's stomach. Believe it or not, as you like, Father said. What do you intend to do? Run me through with that sword and leave my wife and child to fend for themselves? I will if you don't give up your weapon. He jabbed again with the sword. We know you have one. We know where all the Tory weapons in Reading are. Not everybody is willing to play the dog to the king. My father spit. There are traitors everywhere, he shouted. Watch your tongue, or I'll slice it out. Oh, it scared me to hear Father yell at the rebel officer. I wanted him just to be quiet and not make a fuss, to beg even. It made me realize where Sam got his rebelliousness from, though. Father didn't like anybody to tell him what to do, any more than Sam did. Oh, Father, I whispered to myself, please don't talk back. And I guess Father realized that he ought to be more quiet, because he got a grip on himself and said calmly, I'm telling you the truth. My son ran off to join your army and took my gun. We have no weapons here but butcher knives. The officer looked at Father, considering. Finally he said, I don't believe you. He raised the sword. I gasped, and the officer whipped the flat side of the blade across my father's face. My mother shrieked. Father cursed, and a thin line of blood appeared on his cheek and upper lip. I knew what I had to do. I ducked out of the kitchen, dashed across the barnyard, and began to run through the pastures toward Colonel Reed's house. There was one person who knew what had happened to Father's Brown Bess, and he was up at Tom Warp's. Oh, I was scared. The word finally come to Reading, and it was terrible. I guessed pretty easily what was happening. Because Reading had such a reputation for being a Tory town, the rebels had decided to disarm it, at least disarm the Tories. Partly it was to get guns for themselves. Everybody knew that the rebels didn't have enough of anything, guns included. And part of the idea was to make sure that Reading Tories wouldn't be able to do the Continentals what the Minutemen had done to the British at Concord and Lexington 6 months earlier. And I knew the rebels weren't just playing. They'd kill Father if they wanted to. So I ran uphill and down, clambering over the stone and rail fences that divided the pastures. My lungs began to burn, and even though it was cold, my face was soaked with sweat. But I didn't dare stop to rest. All I could see in front of me was that rebel officer pushing a sword through Father's stomach. So I ran on, my breath roaring in my mouth, and my legs getting so weak and trembly that a few times I almost stumbled. Then I saw Tom Warwick's shack, and I stopped running. There was a tiny trickle of smoke drifting up from the chimney, which I could hardly see against the gray sky. I slipped quietly around to the door. The blanket was hanging across it. I pushed it a little aside and peered in. The fire in the circle of stones was practically out, but there was enough light so I could see that there was nobody in the hut but Sam. He was lying on Tom Warup's frame bed on his stomach, with a deerskin rug over him. I could hear him softly breathe and see his back go up and down. I guessed he must have walked a long way to get to Reading and was tired. He was a pretty good sleeper anyway. I'd slept with him all my life, and I knew that he was hard to wake up, even if you punched him. I crept into the hut, leaving the blanket hanging over the door in case somebody should walk by, and knelt down by the bed. I was sorry to wake him up, knowing how tired he must be. I put my hand on the bed to shake it, and suddenly I realized I was touching something funny. I fell along the edge of the bed. There was something hard and long under the blanket. I put my hand under the blanket to feel it better, but already I knew it was the Brown Bess. I guess Sam had got into the habit of sleeping with it, so nobody would steal it. He was lying with his arm across it with the blanket over top of both. Carefully, I slid my hand down the barrel until I got to the stock, gripped it, and gave it a little pull. Sam snorted in his sleep and shook his head, as if he were trying to shake off a fly off his face, but he didn't wake up. I gave the gun another little pull. This time he began to talk loudly, but the words came out nonsense, and I couldn't make them out. I let go of the gun and took my hand out from underneath the blanket, trying to think what to do next. Sam was pretty tired, and being a good sleeper, I figured I might be able to move his arm without waking him up. When we used to sleep together plenty of times, he'd throw his arm or leg over me in his sleep, and I'd have to grunt and heave to get myself untangled from him, and he'd never wake up. I decided to take a chance. I flipped the blanket back a little until his arm and the brown vest were uncovered. Then I quickly bent his arm away so it wasn't lying across the gun anymore. He snorted again, but he didn't wake up. I picked up the gun, ducked through the door of the shack, just pushing the blanket away with my head. When I got outside, I began running across the snow-covered pastures as fast as I could go, praying that I'd get back before anything happened. Ahead of me, as far as I could see, was a trail of my own footprints in the snow, drawn like a line across the fields and fences that divided them up. I was so worried and scared that I didn't even hear Sam coming until I was across Reed's pasture and climbing over a stone wall at the other side. As I slid over the wall, I first heard the heavy thump of running feet. I looked back. Sam was down at the bottom of the pasture, about 100 yards away, charging up at me as fast as he could come. He saw me look at him, but he didn't shout, for fear that somebody would hear him. I leaped over the wall and began running on as fast as I could, but I knew it was hopeless. Sam was bigger and stronger and faster than me. I looked back again. Sam was coming up to the stone wall. He didn't bother to climb it. He just cleared it in one jump and came running on. I turned and swung down to the left in the direction of the road. I didn't think Sam would follow me there for fear of being seen. I tried to pray, but I couldn't think of any right words, and all I could do was whisper over my gasping breath, "Oh, please, God. Oh, please, God." And then Sam was 10 yards behind me. "Timmy," he said in a whispery shout. "For God's sake, Tim, give me that before you hurt yourself." I swiveled around to face him. He lunged at me, grabbing for the muzzle of the gun. He got a couple of fingers on it, but I jerked it out of his grip. He cursed and stuck his fingers in his mouth, and I could see that he got a little gash from the bayonet clip when I jerked it out of his fingers. I leveled the brown vest at his stomach and I said, "Don't come any closer, Sam, or I'll shoot you." I couldn't even hold the gun right. It was too long and too heavy for me to hold against my shoulder the way you're supposed to. I had to hold it against my hip with one hand on the trigger and the other wrapped around the barrel. I knew that if I fired it, I'd be knocked flat, but I didn't care. Sam stared at me. "Timmy." "Don't move, Sam." "It isn't loaded, Tim." "You're a liar." He started to step toward me. "Stand back, Sam, or I'll shoot you in the stomach." Suddenly I began to cry. Not just little tears, but big sobs, all mixed up with trying to get my breath. I felt ashamed of crying in front of Sam and embarrassed, but it was all so terrible I couldn't stop. "Timmy, don't be crazy. It isn't loaded. Now give it to me before it gets damaged." "Jesus, Sam. Jesus, they're down there and they're going to kill Father if he doesn't give them the brown vest." "Who? Who's down there?" "Some Continentals with some others from Fairfield." Then he lunged. I never knew whether I would have pulled the trigger because of the next thing I was lying on the ground with Sam on top of me and he got the gun. My fingers hurt. When I looked at them, I saw that they were bleeding too where they got ripped out of the trigger guard. Sam's face was dead white. "You would have shot me, you little pig, wouldn't you?" He got up off me and I sat up. "Are you all right?" he said. I jumped up. "I wouldn't tell you if I wasn't, you son of a bitch. By this time, they've probably killed Father." "Timmy, I can't go down there." "Why not? They're supposed to be your friends." "I can't, Timmy. I'm not supposed to be here." "What do you mean you're not supposed to be here?" "I'm supposed to be in Danbury buying cattle. They sent me down from Cambridge with Captain Champion, the commissary officer, because I'm from around here." "Did you run away?" "I didn't desert. I just came home for a couple of days. Captain Champion had to go over to Waterbury for something, so I decided to slip home for a day or so." "To see Betsy Reed?" "All right, so what?" Sam said. "Won't you get in trouble?" They won't catch me, Sam said. People are always sneaking off home for a few days. The officers don't know where half the men are a lot of the time. If they came around looking for you, one of your friends says you sprained your ankle and you're coming along behind. Sam, I'm scared about Father. Let's not stand here talking. He looks sort of uneasy. He's probably all right. They've been disarming Tories in lots of places. It's orders from the Connecticut General Assembly. You don't think they're going to let the Tories keep their guns, do you? What'll they do to Father? Oh, probably just push him around a little. They don't shoot people. I saw him, Sam. He was going to stick his sword into Father. You have to go down, Sam. You have to. I can't, Tim. They might hang me for a deserter if they found out. All right, then. Let me take the gun home and give it to them. I can't do that, Tim. If I go back to camp without my weapon, they'll surely hang me. I thought about that. Oh, God, Sam, what did you have to fight for? Why didn't you stay in college? I couldn't, Tim. How could I not go when all my friends were going? I understood that, but I wasn't going to give in. Your family ought to be more important than your friends. He looked embarrassed, but he didn't say anything. I think you're a coward, I said. I didn't really think that. Anybody who joined the army to fight couldn't be a coward, but I was still angry at him. No, I'm not, he said. To tell the truth, it was me who was being the coward. Now that I got calmed down a little, I was afraid of what I might find when I went home. Suppose I walked in and found Father lying on the floor with a hole in his stomach, bleeding to death, and maybe Mother dead too. All right, Sam, if you're not a coward, come home with me and see if everything is all right. He thought about it. I'll go as far as the barn with you. Swiftly, he loaded up the Brown Bess with powder from the horn slung around his neck and a pouch of shot he had dangling from his belt and rammed it home with the ramrod. It impressed me, the casual, easy way he did it. Did you ever kill anybody, Sam? He looked embarrassed again. We haven't done any fighting yet. We set off across the snow fields, uphill and down, the way I'd come. Sam set a pretty good pace. He was hard and strong and used to it from all the marching he'd done, and I had a hard time keeping up. But I was glad to go fast because I was so worried about Father. In 15 minutes we came to our road, crossed it, and circled around back of the house. We ducked into the barn and stared at the tavern. There was smoke coming out of the chimney, but that was all. No sounds, no sign of men, no horses. Nothing happening, Sam said. Come on in with me and see, I said. It's risky, Tim. There's nobody around, I said. He stared at me. We both knew it was his job to go in because he was the older brother. All right, he said, let's go. We darted across the barnyard and into the kitchen. And all of a sudden, there was Father standing there, the line of blood drying on his face. He and Sam stood 5 feet apart, staring at each other. Then Sam turned and ran. Sam, Father shouted. Come back, Sam. But Sam raced across the barnyard and then began pounding over the snowy field toward the woodlot, the Brown Bess under his arm. Father and I ran out into the barnyard and watched him go. Father knew he couldn't catch Sam. We watched him until he got to the stone wall at the edge of our pasture. He jumped up on it and stood there looking back at us. Then suddenly he waved, jumped down from the wall, and disappeared into the woodlot.